Mafia boss at a lunch with his fiancée, until he noticed his ex working there with a baby. Welcome back to Heart-Woven Tales. I'm Selena. Hope you're doing well today. I'd love to know, where are you listening to me from? And while you're here, tell me in the comments, how would you rate my stories out of 10? I pray that wherever you are, love surrounds you, peace fills your heart, and happiness finds its way to you today. I created this story to show that true love isn't always loud or perfect, but it's real, it's patient, and it changes lives in ways we often don't expect. So don't skip ahead. Watch this story till the very end, because every moment is worth your heart and attention. And if you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe to Heart-Woven Tales so we can continue sharing stories that touch the soul. Now, let's dive into today's story and feel every emotion together. Brian Moretti had survived gunfire, betrayals whispered through clenched teeth, and rooms where silence meant death. Yet nothing in his carefully fortified life prepared him for the way time collapsed inside a sunlit restaurant overlooking Lake Como. The place was elegant in a way that suggested permanence, glass catching the blue of the lake, white linen untouched by haste, voices lowered not out of secrecy but privilege, and Brian had chosen it because such places obeyed order. He sat with his spine straight, tailored suit immaculate, posture trained by years of command, lifting his fork with the automatic precision of a man who controlled every movement of his world. That was when it happened. The fork paused mid-air, neither rising nor falling, suspended as if the universe itself had forgotten to continue. And for the first time in a very long while, Brian Moretti felt something slip beyond his control. Across from him, Cassandra Hale was speaking, her voice calm and melodic, shaped by confidence rather than need. She talked about wedding venues nestled among vineyards, about dates that aligned with social calendars and strategic alliances, about futures designed to strengthen legacies already carved in stone. Cassandra was beautiful in a deliberate way. Elegant, composed, born to sit at tables like this and belong, and Brian had always admired how effortlessly she fit into the world he ruled. He nodded at the appropriate moments, offering murmured agreement, his attention divided the way it always was. But then his eyes moved, drawn not by curiosity but by something far more instinctive, something that reached past logic and seized him by the chest. His gaze drifted over Cassandra's shoulder toward the wide windows framing the lake and collided with a figure that should not have existed in this carefully constructed moment. She stood near the window, light spilling over her in a way that felt almost cruel, holding a tray meant for customers, yet pausing as if uncertain where to go next. Alvina. The name didn't surface as a thought, but as a sensation, a memory stitched into his bones. Time did not soften her presence, it sharpened it. She looked older, yes, but not aged, changed in the way people change when life has carved depth into them. Her features were gentler, her posture steadier, her beauty quieter and more devastating for it. This was not the woman frozen in his memory, but the woman she had become, real and undeniable, standing less than 20 steps away. Brian's chest tightened, breath turning shallow, as the world around him dimmed, sounds fading into a distant hum. He had buried this face beneath years of power and distraction, convinced himself that what vanished without explanation deserved no space in the present. And yet, there she was, alive, tangible, unafraid. In her arms was a baby, small and solid against her chest, one hand curled around the edge of her uniform, the other moving with curious restlessness. Brian did not want to look, yet his eyes were dragged downward by a force he could not name. The child turned his head slowly, as if sensing the weight of being watched, and when those eyes lifted, dark, steady, impossibly familiar, something inside Brian cracked open with a soundless violence. It wasn't resemblance alone that shook him. It was recognition. The shape of the gaze, the calm intensity beneath innocence, the unsettling awareness that this child carried echoes of something deeply, frighteningly personal. Brian's fingers tightened around the fork, knuckles whitening, pulse roaring in his ears as the realization pressed against him without fully forming. His body knew before his mind dared to follow. Cassandra noticed the change immediately. She was not a woman who missed shifts in energy, and Brian's sudden stillness set off alarms she couldn't ignore. Her voice faltered, a single word trailing off unfinished as she followed his line of sight. Confusion crossed her features first, then calculation, then a sharpened awareness that something irrevocable had entered the room. She studied the woman by the window, the child in her arms, then turned back to Brian, searching his face for answers he had not yet found himself. "Brian?" she asked softly, not accusing but alert. He didn't respond. His breath stuttered, shallow and unsteady, not from fear but from the shock of recognition colliding with years of denial. This wasn't a ghost or a trick of memory. This was flesh and consequence, standing in plain sight. Alvina felt it then, the unmistakable pull of being seen. Her body stiffened before her mind caught up, fingers instinctively tightening around the tray as something familiar brushed against her awareness like an old wound reopening. She did not turn immediately. Part of her resisted, clinging to the fragile hope that this sensation was imagined, that the past would remain where she had buried it. But fate, it seemed, was no longer interested in restraint. Slowly, as if bracing for impact, she lifted her gaze and met his. The moment stretched, heavy and unbearable, two lives colliding across space and silence. Brian's face drained of color, his expression stripped of authority and replaced by something raw and unguarded. Alvina's breath caught, not in surprise but in recognition she had never truly escaped. The past had not followed her here by accident. It had been waiting. The baby shifted in her arms, making a small sound that cut through the tension like a blade. Brian flinched at the noise, his focus snapping back to the child, to the undeniable truth cradled against Alvina's chest. His heart pounded harder now, each beat carrying a question he was not yet ready to ask but could no longer ignore. Cassandra watched the exchange unfold, the silence between them speaking louder than words, her instincts screaming that this was not a passing distraction, but the unraveling of something fundamental. Around them, the restaurant continued as if nothing had changed. Glasses clinking, laughter rising, the lake glistening in the sun, oblivious to the fact that one man's world had just tilted off its axis. Brian finally lowered his fork, the soft clink against the plate sounding impossibly loud to his ears. He did not know how long he had been frozen, only that something irreversible had already occurred. His past had not returned quietly. It had arrived carrying weight, consequence, and a living question he could not unsee. Cassandra's gaze flicked between him and Alvina, sharp and assessing, while Alvina stood rooted in place, every instinct torn between flight and confrontation. The baby blinked, unaware, breathing steadily against her heart. And in that suspended moment before words were spoken or decisions made, Brian Moretti understood one terrifying truth. Whatever came next, nothing about his life would remain untouched. Alvina felt Brian before she truly saw him, not as a memory or a thought, but as a physical disturbance in the air, like a storm remembered by the skin long after the sky has cleared. A pressure that tightened her spine and slowed her breathing even as she stood still. It was the kind of awareness she had trained herself to ignore over the years, the kind born from loving a dangerous man without ever fearing him, and she hated how instantly her body recognized him despite the time, despite the silence, despite everything she had rebuilt around herself. She kept her gaze lowered for a heartbeat longer than necessary, grounding herself in the weight of her son in her arms, the warmth of his small body pressed against her chest, the steady rhythm of his breathing reminding her why she had chosen this life, this city, this quiet existence far from the echoes of power and blood. Lake Como had been chosen with care, not for beauty alone, but for distance, for its cultured calm, for the way art lived openly here without needing protection, for the way children laughed without learning to look over their shoulders, and she had believed, perhaps foolishly, that safety could be permanent if chosen wisely enough. 5 years ago, she had not run from Brian Moretti in fear, had not fled from gunfire or threats or whispered warnings that followed him like shadows. The truth of her leaving was heavier, more deliberate, and far more cruel in its necessity. She remembered the exact moment her world shifted, sitting alone in a quiet room with documents spread before her, legal language cold and impersonal, each word carving certainty into her chest. The clause had been hidden intentionally, sealed beneath generations of compliance, stating with terrifying clarity that any biological heir born into the Moretti bloodline would not inherit freedom, but obligation, not choice, but preparation, groomed carefully from childhood to serve an organization older than Brian himself. It was not written as cruelty. It was written as tradition, which made it worse. Brian had never seen it, never been meant to see it, because his love for her was genuine and clean, untainted by the machinery that had shaped his inheritance. But love could not erase ink, and innocence could not dismantle a legacy designed to outlive conscience. She had sat with that knowledge for nights that bled into mornings, her hand resting over her stomach as the weight of motherhood settled into her bones long before the world could see it. Every option had demanded sacrifice, and she had chosen the one that hurt her most because it protected the 2 people she loved beyond herself. Telling Brian would have forced him into a war he was never meant to fight, a battle against blood, name, and history, one that could cost him his life or corrupt the very love she wanted to preserve. Staying would have meant accepting a future where her child's path was decided before his first breath, a life where tenderness would always be secondary to obedience. So she chose silence, not because she lacked courage, but because she had too much of it to demand that love fix what power had broken. She chose distance over romance, truth over comfort, knowing the world would never applaud her for it. Now, standing only a short distance away, she felt the fragile architecture of that choice begin to fracture. Brian was here, not as a memory, but as a presence shaped by time and authority, his power visible even in stillness, his reputation trailing him like an unseen entourage. She did not need to look directly at him to know he had changed, yet not enough to erase the man she once knew intimately. Power had refined him, hardened his edges, but it had not erased the quiet gravity that had drawn her to him in the first place. The room felt smaller with him in it, the space between breaths heavy, and Alvina tightened her hold on her son instinctively, angling her body protectively, as though shielding him from more than just eyes. This was the moment she had prepared for in theory, but never truly believed would arrive, the collision of a past she had sealed away and a present she had fought to protect. She sensed Brian stand before she heard the sound of his chair moving, the shift in energy rippling outward like a tide changing direction. The restaurant continued its rhythm around them, unaware, indifferent, glasses clinking and voices rising and falling, but to Alvina, it felt as though the world had narrowed to the space between her and the man approaching her. Each step he took forward tightened something in her chest, memories pressing forward uninvited, images of quiet nights and shared laughter threatening to soften her resolve. She forced herself to remain still, to breathe evenly, to remember that love alone was never enough to shield a child from legacy. Her son stirred slightly, sensing the tension, his small fingers curling into her clothing, and she whispered softly to him, grounding herself in the present even as the past demanded acknowledgement. As Brian closed the distance, stopping close enough that she could feel the heat of his presence, Alvina finally lifted her eyes fully to meet his. The look on his face struck her harder than anger ever could. Not fury, not accusation, but shock edged with something dangerously close to recognition. His gaze flicked once, involuntarily, to the child in her arms, and she saw the exact second the question formed behind his eyes, heavy and unavoidable. Her heart pounded, not from fear of confrontation, but from the realization that silence was reaching its limit. She had built her life on the belief that love could be preserved through sacrifice, that truth could be delayed without destroying what it protected. Standing there now, with Brian Moretti staring at her and at the child she had hidden from him, she understood how fragile that belief truly was. Love, she realized, did not fade when abandoned. It did not weaken when denied. It waited, patient and unyielding, for the moment it could no longer be ignored. And as Brian's gaze settled on her son again, lingering just a second too long, Alvina felt the weight of the future press in from all sides, knowing that the next words spoken by either of them would shatter the careful balance she had maintained for 5 years. The past was no longer content to be remembered. It was demanding answers. Brian Moretti's eyes never wavered from the child in Alvina's arms, a 4-year-old who embodied every choice she had made, every sacrifice kept quiet, every moment she had endured alone to protect a life that belonged to both of them, yet had been denied. His gaze was heavy, deliberate, unflinching, not fueled by anger or accusation, but by the recognition of a truth he had unknowingly abandoned, a future he had never been told he was losing. The entire restaurant seemed to shrink around them, the polished tables and sparkling cutlery fading into irrelevance as the gravity of that single moment drew all attention inward, toward the 3 figures standing at the center of attention that could not be mediated or ignored. Brian's hand hung at his side, empty and idle, because nothing he carried, knife, pen, authority, power, could alter the reality before him, and yet he was utterly unarmed in the way that mattered most, because this confrontation demanded honesty, presence, and an acknowledgement that had long been withheld. Alvina's lips parted slightly, her voice soft but deliberate as it carried a single, almost unimaginable answer: 4. The number landed in the air with the weight of confession, more powerful than any scream, more revealing than any accusation. Brian felt it as a shockwave, a physical pull against the walls of his chest, each beat hammering as though his heart were trying to reclaim lost time. He didn't move closer, didn't reach instinctively. He allowed himself to pause, letting the magnitude of the revelation settle like smoke in the quiet air, giving himself permission to see fully what had been hidden from him for years. Around them, the restaurant paused without meaning to, patrons frozen mid-bite, waiters holding trays uncertainly, the hum of conversation dropping to a near whisper as though the walls themselves recognized that a private epoch of history had just intruded into the public present. Cassandra Hale watched every motion, every imperceptible tremor in Brian's shoulders, every hesitation of his hands, every flicker of recognition in his eyes. She was a woman trained to read rooms, to assess threats, to understand undercurrents of power, and yet this moment confounded even her disciplined instincts. This was not an argument to be won, not a scandal to be leveraged, not a mistake to be corrected. This was revelation, pure and simple, layered with consequences she could only begin to comprehend. Her fingers tightened lightly around the edge of her chair, her body poised yet restrained, elegance unbroken, but her mind racing with the awareness that every second stretched the space between what she had known and what she was seeing. And in that moment, she understood with sharp clarity that Brian was facing a choice unlike any he had ever encountered, one that no contract, no legacy, no wealth could dictate. Recognition of the past, acknowledgement of responsibility, and confrontation with a truth that had never been his to ignore. The air between them thickened further as Cassandra's voice cut through, calm but deliberate, sharp enough to carry its weight across the silent restaurant. "Is this your child?" The words were neither accusation nor plea. They were a test, a boundary, a moment of clarity demanded from Brian, whose eyes had remained fixed on the child who looked back at him with the innocence of a life that had known love, yet not his. Brian inhaled slowly, the sound almost imperceptible, and for a heartbeat, hesitation flickered at the edges of his expression, an almost human crack in a man who had spent years perfecting control over every situation, but only for a moment. Then, with quiet certainty that carried decades of love, loss, and regret in its simple syllable, he answered, "Yes." The word was neither loud nor performative, yet it reverberated through the room with the authority of undeniable truth. Patrons looked up, curiosity and shock mingling on their faces, but no one dared interrupt. The weight of honesty demanded attention greater than gossip or spectacle. Silence followed, a heavy pause pregnant with consequence. It was not scandal that hung in the air. It was truth, unflinching and unadorned. Cassandra did not cry. She did not plead. She did not degrade herself by begging for explanations that would not matter. Her response was as deliberate and clean as the lines of her couture gown, a measured acknowledgement of reality. She stood, her movements graceful, controlled, her sharp gaze catching both Brian and Alvina simultaneously, assessing and weighing, yet never faltering in dignity. Then she spoke, each word precise, like a scalpel cutting through the invisible threads of expectation. "Then, the man I agreed to marry no longer exists." The sentence landed with the quiet finality of a verdict. No judgment, no threat, no anger, only acknowledgement of fact. Cassandra turned and walked away, the click of her heels against marble echoing with a resonance that seemed to mark the end of one life and the beginning of another, leaving Brian frozen between the woman he loved and the life he had never known, he had abandoned. Alvina remained still, heart pounding, realizing that the world had narrowed to the space between them, to the child in her arms, to the man whose presence had always demanded more than she could give. The baby stirred slightly, as if sensing the tension that rippled like invisible waves between adults who carried too much history, and Alvina's fingers tightened instinctively, protecting more than just the child. They were shielding the fragile remnants of trust and hope she had dared to nurture alone. Brian's chest rose and fell with quiet determination, his gaze unwavering even as he tried to reconcile a love interrupted by absence, a future denied by circumstance, and a responsibility that now stood as concrete, undeniable, and impossible to ignore. He did not speak because no words could capture the collision of emotions surging inside him: rage at his ignorance, grief for lost years, awe at the life he had almost missed, and longing sharpened by years of silence. Minutes, or perhaps seconds, stretched into eternity as the restaurant continued around them, oblivious to the seismic shift unfolding at its center. Brian's eyes, dark and penetrating, shifted from Alvina to the child again, each glance a silent calculation, a negotiation, an apology unspoken. Alvina felt the weight of his presence, not threatening, not possessive, but a magnetic pull of a truth too long suppressed. She realized with a clarity that hurt like a physical blow. Love had not disappeared. It had waited, patient, unyielding, and insistent. And now it was demanding acknowledgement, presence, and reckoning in a space that had once been safe, now charged with possibilities she was not yet ready to name. Brian finally inhaled, the first deliberate, audible breath he had taken since stepping into the room. The child stirred again, reaching a tiny hand toward him, a gesture instinctive, unconscious yet powerful enough to demand response. Brian's eyes softened, yet a storm of questions remained unspoken, about absence, about choices, about years stolen by circumstance and misunderstanding. He knew that what he did next could either heal or break the fragile world Alvina had constructed. And before he could move, before he could speak, before the first syllable could pass his lips, Cassandra's departing figure lingered in his peripheral vision, a living reminder that decisions had consequences, that some truths were irreversible, and that stepping forward now would redefine every life in this room forever. Brian stood frozen, Alvina waiting, child in arms, a man and a woman bound by love and loss, facing a question that had no easy answer. And in that suspended, heavy silence, the world seemed to hold its breath as he realized the weight of what he had just discovered. The past had returned, and nothing would ever be the same again. The reader is left wondering how Brian will respond, what he will do next, and whether Alvina will trust him with the life she has protected alone. Brian followed Alvina out of the restaurant, the doors closing behind them with a muted click that somehow felt like the severing of old worlds, and the sudden rush of Lake Como's wind greeted them, crisp and unpredictable, carrying the scent of water and earth and the faint tang of distant rain. The city seemed to pause in recognition, the chatter of nearby tables replaced by the soft slap of waves against stone embankments and the far-off cry of gulls circling above, leaving space for everything unsaid to breathe between them. Brian's footsteps were careful, deliberate, as though approaching a delicate truth that could shatter if handled too casually. His gaze remained fixed on Alvina, taking in the curve of her shoulders beneath the soft fabric of her dress, the way she carried her son with ease and a quiet authority that both infuriated and mesmerized him. Each step felt like a negotiation with time itself, a reclamation of years stolen, and yet he could not summon the words that would bridge the chasm between the life he thought he had and the reality now laid bare in front of him. Alvina kept walking, steady and measured, though her pulse was a rapid drum against the quiet, a rhythm she forced herself to ignore. She had rehearsed these words countless times, not in exact phrasing, but in the emotional architecture required to survive this encounter without crumbling. 5 years of solitude had honed her voice to a weapon sharper than any knife, tempered with honesty and shielded by love. When Brian finally asked the question that had lingered between them since he first saw her, his tone low but commanding, precise yet brittle with restraint, she did not soften the answer. "Why did you leave?" he asked, the single line slicing through the wind as if trying to cleave the years between them, as if he expected a simple excuse to explain the impossible. Alvina's lips pressed together, steady but not without tremor, and she allowed herself a slow exhale before speaking. "I left because I discovered a future for our child you would never have chosen," she said, her voice quiet, measured, carrying the weight of all the nights she had spent awake, hands trembling over documents she could not yet show him. Brian stopped mid-step, the world tilting ever so slightly, because those words contained more than accusation. They carried truth, precision, and the moral gravity of someone who had loved him enough to protect what he could not see. Alvina drew a folded stack of papers from her bag, worn at the edges, creased from years of carrying evidence of a life written without consent. She handed them to him, each sheet a stone pressing against the man he thought he knew, revealing the clauses, the legal bindings, the sealed future that had been prepared for their child in his name, without his knowledge, without his permission, without his right to choose. Brian's eyes moved methodically across the inked words, absorbing the gravity of the bureaucracy that had enslaved the innocent, the meticulous design of power wielded without conscience. The baby, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, stirred in Alvina's arms, lifting tiny fingers instinctively toward Brian, as if drawn to a presence he could not yet fully claim. Brian froze, a sudden ache tightening his chest, because the gesture was simple, ordinary, and yet seismic in its implication. The child did not yet know the weight of legacy, the pressure of a name forged by violence and law, and here he was, reaching out to the man who had unknowingly abandoned him. Brian did not touch the baby immediately, though every instinct in his body screamed to do so. His hands hovered at his sides, taut with emotion, trembling ever so slightly from the shock of revelation and the realization that love, though buried for years, had endured. He swallowed hard, his throat constricted by a combination of awe, guilt, and relief, as he finally whispered, more to himself than to anyone else, "You didn't steal my child. You saved him." Alvina's gaze met his for the first time without shields or deflection, her brown eyes steady and luminous under the soft afternoon light, revealing the vulnerability she had carried for half a decade and the resolve that had allowed her to survive without him. The words settled between them, unspoken apologies and confessions intertwining like smoke, and Brian felt his world shift violently on its axis. Rage surfaced, not at Alvina, not at her decisions, but at the bloodline that had dictated his life from the moment he was born. He had believed himself free, thought himself master of every choice, yet the trap of legacy had been written into him, a silent chain shaping his every move until now. His chest rose and fell rapidly, a storm restrained by the thin veneer of control, and Alvina felt the tremor in his presence, an almost imperceptible quiver in the man she had once loved more than life itself. For the first time, Brian allowed himself to truly see the sacrifices she had made, not just leaving him, but constructing a sanctuary for their child in a world that demanded vigilance and cunning. Every decision, every quiet moment, every unseen effort over the last 5 years now unfolded before him in stark clarity, and it was overwhelming. The baby stirred again, cooing softly, tiny fingers brushing Brian's hand as though recognizing a soul that had long been missing from its orbit. Brian's heart, unaccustomed to being soft, felt an unfamiliar weight pressing insistently, demanding acknowledgement. The man who had built empires, signed death warrants, and controlled loyalty with an iron fist now realized that power meant nothing without presence, that authority was meaningless without love, and that the child in Alvina's arms was the truest measure of both. Alvina watched him, reading the conflict on his face with practiced caution, waiting for the storm to settle before making any decisions herself. She did not need words to convey the intensity of the moment. Her eyes, steady and unwavering, told him everything, that she had acted out of love, that she had protected both him and the child, that she had waited without hope for recognition, and that now, finally, the truth demanded attention. Brian's shoulders sagged slightly as he absorbed the weight of her gaze, the documents in his hands, the child reaching instinctively toward him. Rage, grief, longing, and awe collided within him, leaving him suspended between past mistakes and the choices he could still make. Finally, he spoke, low and measured, the first words he had allowed to leave his lips since stepping out into the wind. I didn't know. I had no idea." His voice cracked under the weight of unspoken regrets, and Alvina's lips pressed into a thin, controlled line, containing both relief and an unshakable caution. "You couldn't have," she said softly, her tone tempered with the quiet authority of someone who has survived the consequences of another's ignorance. "But now you do, and now we must decide what comes next. Not for you, not for me, but for him." Her hand, lightly resting on the baby's back, emphasized the gravity of her words, reminding him that this child was not just evidence of the past. It was a life demanding protection, guidance, and love, untainted by the mistakes of the adults around him. Brian's mind raced, the wind whipping against his coat, tugging at his collar, carrying the faint scent of rain and earth, mirroring the turbulence inside him. He wanted to reach out, to embrace, to apologize without words, yet he understood that even now, no gesture could undo the years of absence. He could only begin again, one step at a time, earning trust that had never been given freely, proving that the man who had been absent was capable of presence. And as he stared down at the small, perfect life in Alvina's arms, he realized with sharp, staggering clarity that love had never abandoned him. It had protected him. It had waited, and it was now demanding acknowledgement in a world that no longer allowed escape. The lake stretched endlessly behind them, indifferent to human struggles, reflecting sunlight and shadow in equal measure. Yet in its calm expanse, Brian saw the enormity of responsibility and the fleeting opportunity for redemption. Alvina's gaze never wavered, holding his in quiet challenge, and the baby's fingers curled instinctively around the corner of her dress, tugging ever so slightly, a tiny, innocent gesture that carried the weight of everything unspoken. Brian felt himself suspended between the man he had been and the man he could become, the choices he had ignored and the responsibilities he now could not escape. And just as he opened his mouth to speak again, to bridge the years with words or promises, a sudden movement in the corner of his eye caught him, the shadow of someone approaching, deliberate, urgent, yet unseen by Alvina. His instincts, honed over decades, screamed silently in his chest. Something, or someone, was here, watching, waiting. And in that frozen, wind-swept instant, Brian realized that the truth, though finally confronted, might not be enough to protect them all. Brian senses an unknown presence, implying danger or interruption is coming, leaving the audience desperate to see what happens next. 5. The wind from the lake still carried the subtle echo of Brian's presence as Cassandra Hale left the restaurant, her heels clicking softly against the polished marble floor, each sound deliberate and resonant, marking her passage through a world that no longer contained the man she thought she would marry. Her mind, usually so precise and commanding, was quietly unraveling under the weight of truth, but she allowed herself no outward sign of it. She did not cry, she did not stumble, she did not allow the shock of discovery to become weakness. Cassandra was a woman of clarity, and clarity demanded acknowledgement. She had loved Brian. She had envisioned a life with him. She had counted on the certainty of his loyalty and transparency. Yet now, she found herself facing a reality where love had been intertwined with hidden legacies and unspoken sacrifices, things she could never have anticipated. And though her heart throbbed with betrayal, it was not aimed at Alvina, nor at the innocent child whose very existence had rewritten her world. Cassandra's footsteps carried her to a quiet corner of the restaurant terrace, where she could finally breathe without the weight of onlookers. The air was cooler here, carrying the scent of rain-soaked stone and the subtle fragrance of the lake, grounding her as she considered the magnitude of what had just transpired. Her reflection in the glass railing was steady, composed, but within it was a maelstrom of emotions she refused to let show. She had always believed that love justified endurance, that compromise could bridge gaps in loyalty, but tonight she realized that integrity was a higher standard than desire, and that self-respect was a currency more precious than devotion misplaced. Cassandra had been confronted not with infidelity in the conventional sense, but with a truth she had no control over, a secret that existed beyond her awareness, yet affected the very foundations of her intended life with Brian. Her thoughts returned to Alvina, the woman who had carried a child in secret, who had protected that child from a legacy neither parent had chosen. Cassandra, had watched the interactions. Every subtle gesture, every exchange of words, every careful movement of body and gaze that spoke volumes. There had been no malice, no pretense, no schemes designed to hurt or humiliate. Alvina's actions were deliberate, protective, and rooted in love, love that had shielded Brian and their child from the insidious consequences of his family's unyielding rules. The realization hit Cassandra like a cold, illuminating light. She had been wrong to see Alvina as a rival. She had been trained to perceive women in a binary of friend or foe. But here, she was witnessing the rare, immutable power of truth expressed through courage. And that recognition shifted something within her, a transformation from resentment to respect, from anger to understanding, from fear to quiet dignity. Later that night, Brian approached Cassandra in the expansive lounge of his penthouse, the city lights glittering like shards of gold against the glass windows behind him. He had expected confrontation, tears, anger, perhaps a tirade demanding explanations, and yet Cassandra's presence was calm, collected, yet unmistakably final. Her posture did not waver, her gaze did not flinch, and her voice, when she spoke, carried neither accusation nor plea, only absolute honesty. "I won't marry a man whose truth was hidden, even from himself," she said, and each word landed with measured precision, deliberately weighing both the gravity of her choice and the freedom she was granting him. Brian, for the first time in years, felt the unsettling dissonance of power meeting truth, the realization that influence, wealth, and dominance were meaningless when faced with uncompromising integrity. Cassandra did not curse Alvina. She did not blame the child. She did not lash out at the man who had unknowingly been shaped by forces beyond her control. Instead, she did something far more formidable. She withdrew with dignity. Her exit was not chaos. It was liberation, for herself and, in its own way, for Brian. By leaving without vengeance, without malice, without dramatics, she created a space, a quiet, consequential space that demanded honesty, reflection, and reckoning. In that space, Brian could finally confront the truth he had evaded for years, unmediated by fear, unpolluted by guilt, and unbound by the expectations of another woman's devotion. Cassandra's refusal to become a villain redefined the parameters of responsibility, not only for Brian, but for everyone in the orbit of this fractured, delicate moment. Brian's hands trembled subtly as he watched her leave, the echo of her words lingering like a subtle vibration against his ribs. The realization struck him. No woman had ever forced him into such clarity, into the confrontation with his own moral and emotional deficiencies, without coercion or manipulation. The choice he now faced was untainted by desperation or obligation. It was entirely his. He could no longer hide behind wealth, power, or fear of family legacy. He had to decide who he was, who he wanted to be, and what kind of father and man he would allow himself to become. Alvina's protective love, the child's innocence, and Cassandra's unwavering integrity had constructed a moment so precise in its demand for truth that failure was impossible. Brian could not turn away, and yet stepping forward felt terrifying because the stakes were beyond anything he had ever known, higher than any empire, deeper than any contract, and infinitely more fragile than the fragile trust he had lost before it had even been earned. Alvina remained in her apartment nearby, unaware that Cassandra's words were reshaping the landscape of Brian's decisions. She tended to the child with careful movements, soothing, attentive, loving, but with one eye always on the door, as if expecting the man she loved to arrive at any moment, fully and without hesitation. The weight of responsibility and unspoken expectations pressed down on Brian's shoulders like lead as he stood at the intersection of past love, present truth, and future obligation. Every instinct he had cultivated over a lifetime of power and control was inadequate here. The simplicity of love and responsibility was complicated by time, secrecy, and the fragile hearts of the women who had shaped his life without realizing it. And yet, as the night deepened, the city lights flickering like distant stars reflected in the water, Brian realized something terrifying. He had to act, but any action could fracture the delicate trust, the fragile equilibrium, or the fragile hope that Alvina had nurtured for so long. Cassandra's exit had left a vacuum, one that required not just courage, but moral clarity, emotional honesty, and the ability to navigate the precarious lines between apology, authority, and love. One wrong word, one misstep, and the tenuous possibility of rebuilding what had been broken could be lost forever. Brian's eyes, dark and unyielding, shifted to the night sky, searching for answers in constellations that offered none. He felt the gravity of choice like a weight pressing against his chest, the echoes of every past failure, every lost moment, every opportunity he had ignored, amplifying in his mind. Alvina and the child were waiting, innocent and vulnerable, yet deserving of everything he could give. Cassandra had withdrawn, not as an adversary, but as a silent reminder of consequence and integrity. And as Brian stepped toward the open night, toward the uncertain path that lay ahead, he sensed the first tremors of what would demand everything of him. Not power, not influence, not wealth, but love, humility, and an unflinching confrontation with the truth he had avoided for far too long. Then, as he reached the edge of the terrace, his phone buzzed, an unknown number flashing against the dark screen. Brian glanced at it briefly, expecting perhaps a message from a business associate or a routine call, but the tone carried a cold weight, a subtle threat, the kind that made his instincts roar. Whoever was contacting him knew about the chaos of the day. They knew about Alvina, the child, Cassandra's exit, and they were watching. The presence of danger, subtle and deliberate, reminded him sharply that the challenges of love and honesty would not exist in a vacuum. There were forces beyond his comprehension, waiting to exploit every crack. Brian receives an ominous call, signaling danger, leaving the audience desperate to see what happens next. The call from the unknown number lingered in Brian's mind like a ghost, long after the screen went dark. He had survived countless threats, whispers from the underworld, and betrayals that had cost others their lives. Yet this call felt different, calibrated not for fear, but for consequence. It reminded him sharply that love, though rare and profound, could not exist in isolation. His heart had been awakened by the truth, by Alvina's courage and Cassandra's integrity, but the world beyond their fragile bubble remained relentless, poised to exploit any vulnerability. He drew a deep breath, the lake's night wind brushing against his face, carrying the faint aroma of rain-soaked stone and distant flowers, and realized that the life he wanted, the life of honesty, presence, and love, would demand as much courage as any battle he had ever fought, with blood or law. Brian's first step was not dramatic, it was deliberate. The family trust, a fortress of contracts, obligations, and binding legal clauses that had enslaved generations of his bloodline, was carefully, methodically dismantled. Each contract torn, each clause voided, each signature contested in silent courts or whispered negotiations represented a chain removed from the lives of everyone who had been bound to it. No explosions, no violence, no public spectacle, just the quiet assertion that power could be wielded differently. The kind of power that dominated had been his inheritance. The kind of power that liberated required choice, sacrifice, and courage. And as Brian moved through the process, every paper, every clause, every signature felt like an act of penance as well as an act of love. He was rewriting legacy, not for himself, but for the child who deserved a life unshackled by the sins of ancestry. Alvina observed from a distance, refusing to hope prematurely. She had learned long ago that hope in Brian's world could be fragile, easily shattered by circumstance, by legacy, by men whose love was entangled with power rather than freedom. Her eyes followed him, silent and unjudging, as he walked through corridors of law and tradition she would never step into. Every closed door he passed, every negotiation conducted without spectacle, was proof that he was changing, not just through words, but through action. And yet she kept herself guarded. She refused to let the faintest whisper of expectation soften her vigilance. 5 years of protecting a child alone had taught her that love must be earned daily, in both small and monumental acts, and that the man who wanted her trust could not claim it with declarations alone. Nights passed slowly, no grand gestures, no elaborate apologies, only presence. Brian would arrive without announcement, sit quietly, observing the child with careful attention, responding to every small question or movement with patience he had never known he possessed. Alvina noticed the subtle shifts, how he spoke without command, how he held the child without dominance, how he listened without judgment. Each action was deliberate, slow, patient, demanding no recognition, expecting no reward. It was a transformation wrought not through passion, not through force, but through self-awareness and humility. The child, innocent and perceptive beyond his years, responded not with words of judgment, but with trust built over incremental moments of authenticity. And in these quiet, unspectacular evenings, Brian learned a lesson older and wiser than any he had studied in books, older than any he had been taught in the halls of power. Authority is meaningless without love. Presence is more powerful than fear, and redemption is earned silently. Alvina noticed other changes too. Brian's gaze softened, not just toward the child, but toward her. It was tentative, careful, a man testing boundaries, honoring space and seeking permission rather than assuming possession. He no longer approached her with the arrogance or dominance that had once defined him. Instead, he approached as someone seeking reconciliation with not just her, but with himself. He spoke less about the empire he had inherited, less about contracts or enemies, and more about life. The small joys of watching the child laugh, the quiet victories of a day untainted by violence, the simple satisfaction of presence rather than conquest. And through it all, Alvina felt a stirring she had suppressed for years, a recognition that love had finally caught up to responsibility, that the man before her was no longer the one who had left, but someone reshaped by choice, conscience, and devotion. The moment of reckoning arrived one evening when Brian, after weeks of quiet vigilance, spoke words that carried both weight and vulnerability. "I choose him," he said, voice low but unwavering, "even if I lose everything else." The child, curled against Alvina, looked up with innocent comprehension, sensing the magnitude of the declaration without fully understanding it. Alvina's heart, already taut with caution, skipped a beat. The gravity of those words stretched beyond romance or paternal instinct. They were an unambiguous acknowledgement that he was willing to dismantle his legacy, challenge his family, and risk everything for the life they had built in secret. Love, tempered by responsibility, had emerged not as a spectacle, but as an act of bravery far greater than any confrontation or empire he had ever commanded. Yet even in this triumph, the shadows of consequence lingered. The family he had defied, the silent watchers of his empire, the unseen forces poised to capitalize on vulnerability, none of them rested. Brian's declaration was not a shield from danger, it was a target. Alvina recognized it immediately. Love had returned, responsibility had been embraced, and yet the stakes were higher than ever. The child's safety, their fragile peace, the precarious freedom Brian had just purchased with sacrifice. Each element could be compromised with a single misstep. Her eyes met his across the table, and in that glance was a shared understanding. The battle was not yet over, and the world would not yield to love simply because they desired it. Days turned into weeks. Brian continued to navigate the delicate balance between presence and power. He attended to business only enough to maintain control without dominance, ensuring that the dismantling of the trust was thorough, final, and irrefutable. Alvina observed, silent, her respect for him deepening with each measured choice, each act of patience, each gesture proving that his love was not performative, not reactive, but deliberate and selfless. The child began to mirror this transformation, learning through observation that loyalty, trust, and love were earned and sustained through consistency and integrity. Every laugh shared, every story told, every meal quietly prepared together built a foundation stronger than any contract, deeper than any inheritance, and far more permanent than any vow or promise could ever convey. And yet, as nights deepened and serenity seemed to take hold, the sense of inevitable danger persisted. Brian's instincts, honed through decades of negotiation, threat assessment, and survival in a world built on dominance, whispered constantly that they were not yet free. Someone was watching, calculating, waiting for a moment to exploit weakness. The shadows cast by candlelight in Alvina's apartment, the subtle movement of figures across the lake at night, the occasional, unidentifiable communication he intercepted, all reminded him that love and responsibility, no matter how profound, existed in a world that demanded vigilance. Alvina sensed it too, the tension beneath his calm, the readiness in his posture, the quiet calculation in his gaze. Then came the evening that crystallized the magnitude of their situation. Brian was holding the child, watching him attempt to reach a floating paper boat across the lake's edge, when a sudden, almost imperceptible ripple in the water caught his attention. The movement was deliberate, too precise to be random, and his entire body tensed instinctively. Alvina froze, sensing the shift in the air as Brian's hand hovered protectively over the child's back. Every instinct screamed danger, yet he did not panic, he did not shout, he only observed with precision, calculating, preparing, waiting. It was a silent testament to the transformation he had undergone, authority tempered by love, instinct sharpened by responsibility, patience forged in understanding, and courage anchored in care. And then, from the shadowed corner of the pier, a figure emerged, someone familiar, yet unexpected. Brian's eyes narrowed, Alvina stiffened, and the child gurgled innocently, unaware of the storm that had just returned. The figure's gaze locked with Brian's, calm but deliberate, carrying a weight of unspoken intent, a history intertwined with danger, and a promise that their fragile peace was about to be tested. 1 year later, the world felt lighter, quieter, and infinitely more honest. The grandeur, the shadows, the obligations that had once dictated every movement of Brian's life had dissolved into memories he now carried with solemnity and purpose, rather than weight and shame. The lake sparkled with the soft reflections of early morning sunlight. The gentle ripples chasing one another like time itself had slowed to watch this moment unfold. A small cafe, simple and unassuming, sat at the water's edge, its whitewashed walls and rustic wooden tables whispering stories of laughter, conversation, and life unpolished by fear or obligation. Here, no guards, no business deals. No shadows haunted the edges of their lives, only presence. It was ordinary in appearance, but extraordinary in meaning. Brian sat across from Alvina, the child nestled between them, drawing small patterns on the table with crayons, and the innocent focus of someone who did not yet understand the magnitude of being the reason two adults had rewritten everything for love. Brian poured juice into 3 glasses, the movement careful, deliberate, almost ritualistic, the way one honors something fragile, valuable, and irreplaceable. He did not spill, did not hesitate, did not glance up to command attention. He moved as if each gesture were an offering of presence rather than authority. Alvina laughed, a sound light, unburdened, unshackled, and for the first time in years, free from the vigilance and restraint that had marked every moment since they reunited. Her laughter filled the cafe, spilling into the air with warmth that seemed to settle over the lake, over the tables, over the small town that had no awareness of the storm their lives had once endured. Brian's gaze softened, reflecting not ownership, but appreciation, not desire, but reverence for her joy, for her resilience, for the woman who had carried the weight of their shared past with dignity, courage, and unwavering love. Their son, blissfully unaware of the chaos that had once defined his father's world, traced patterns on the table with quiet concentration, alternating between drawing small boats and clumsy shapes that hinted at a budding imagination. His laughter occasionally punctuated the soft conversations around them, and each time he looked up at Brian or Alvina, the parents felt the gravity of existence itself distilled into a simple, profound truth. Love, when nurtured, transforms everything. The child's presence was a constant reminder that their choices had mattered, that sacrifices had been justified, and that the future, finally theirs to shape, was untainted by legacy, fear, or deceit. Brian reached forward, instinctively brushing the child's hair from his forehead, an act unspoken but full of devotion. He did not dictate, he did not order, he simply existed in harmony with the small life before him. Brian did not propose again, not with gold or diamonds, not with grand gestures or declarations designed to command compliance. He had learned that the power of presence outweighed any ceremony, that love was not something demanded or coerced, but something earned through consistency, humility, and care. Alvina did not need promises in ink or word. She needed authenticity, steadiness, and the quiet assurance that he would remain when no one else watched, when no outside pressures demanded attention, when life itself could not be scripted. And Brian, having rebuilt himself through sacrifice, patience, and the dismantling of every legacy that once enslaved him, had finally arrived at that understanding. Love was not an explosion, a claim, or a performance. It was enduring, patient, and real. Alvina watched him carefully, noting the subtle changes that time and responsibility had wrought. His shoulders, once rigid with the burden of authority, were now relaxed. His eyes, once sharp with calculation and unyielding focus, were now soft, warm, and attentive. The quiet strength he radiated was not the kind that commanded fear, but the kind that inspired trust. She saw the man he had fought to become, and for the first time, she allowed herself to feel the absence of doubt, the certainty of shared understanding, the peace that arrived only when someone proves themselves through consistent, unspoken actions rather than grand gestures. She smiled softly, a quiet acknowledgement that the love between them was no longer a gamble. It was a certainty they had carved from the chaos of years past. Across the table, the sun glinted off the water, casting golden streaks that danced on the edges of Brian's face. He reached for Alvina's hand, not to claim it, not to possess it, but to ask in the quietest, most unspoken way for her choice, her acceptance, her continued presence. His fingers brushed hers lightly, a gentle connection that carried decades of history, longing, regret, and hope. Alvina looked at him, and in that moment the world around them ceased to exist. She did not need to speak. The answer was in her eyes, in the tilt of her head, in the warmth of her smile. She stayed, not because love demanded it, not because obligation or guilt compelled her, but because the truth had arrived, unvarnished and undeniable, and it allowed her to choose freely without fear, without hesitation, and with full acknowledgement of the man he had become. The cafe, the lake, the child tracing patterns oblivious to destiny, all of it seemed to breathe with them. Patrons nearby were unaware of the storm that had once defined Brian Moretti's world, unaware of the empires dismantled, the contracts voided, the lives risked and rebuilt. And yet, within this ordinary scene lay the extraordinary. A man had rewritten the power he had inherited, a woman had reclaimed her autonomy, and a child had become the fulcrum around which two fractured lives had finally aligned. Brian's hand remained lightly on hers, their connection steady, and in that touch was a promise, not of perfection but of presence, constancy, and the quiet endurance of love. Even in this moment of peace, Brian's mind retained a careful edge, a vigilance born from years of survival. He was aware, intimately, that life was rarely linear, that danger could arise from the smallest crack, and that the freedom they had fought for could never be taken for granted. Yet the fear no longer ruled him. It was tempered by the quiet, consistent certainty of shared choice, of love tested and proven resilient, of a child who needed neither empire nor legacy, but only the devotion of those who had chosen him. They sat together as the day matured into evening, the lake turning from gold to silver, the sky a canvas of muted purples and soft blues, and the child fell asleep against Alvina's shoulder, exhausted by play and unaware of the significance of the family he now belonged to. Brian adjusted a shawl over Alvina's shoulders, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and felt a serenity he had never known possible in the midst of chaos. The years of power, the legacies, the threats, the uncertainty, all of it had led to this singular, unremarkable, yet profound moment of domestic harmony. Brian finally spoke, his voice low, steady, intimate. "We don't need ceremonies or gold. We just need this. We need us." Alvina nodded, her eyes glimmering with the quiet tears of relief, love, and recognition. She leaned into him slightly, allowing herself to be held, not as a surrender, but as a mutual acknowledgement that love, corrected by truth and tempered by responsibility, had returned in its purest form. The child stirred, half awake, and Brian smiled softly, bridging the gap between past pain and present joy. Their laughter mingled, soft and unguarded, filling the space around them with warmth. In that moment it was clear. Power had been rewritten, legacy had been tamed, love, unpretentious and real, had claimed its place. The lake reflected the light of a world indifferent to human struggle. Yet within that indifference lay the extraordinary truth. They had survived, chosen each other, and built a life that no contract, no threat, no past mistake could undo. Brian squeezed Alvina's hand gently, a silent promise to continue walking the path of presence, patience, and love. And she, at last, allowed herself to fully stay, knowing that this was not a return, but a beginning. The city beyond the lake moved on, oblivious, indifferent. Yet inside this small cafe at the edge of the world, history had been rewritten, hearts had been healed, and love had finally sat freely at the table. Brian, Alvina, and their child formed a quiet, unbreakable triangle of trust, hope, and belonging. No grandeur, no spectacle, no inherited power could ever compare to this simplicity, this clarity, this ultimate truth that they had fought to create together. And as the sun dipped behind the distant mountains, bathing the lake in warm twilight, Brian and Alvina exchanged a look that carried decades of pain, courage, endurance, and finally, unshakable love. In that silent exchange, they understood. Life would continue, challenges would arrive, But they were no longer bound by fear, legacy, or secrets. They had chosen each other fully, honestly, and without reservation. Love had returned, quietly, corrected, humbled, and real. And this time, it would never leave. Thank you for joining us on this unforgettable journey of love, sacrifice, and redemption. Brian, Alvina, and their son showed us that true love isn't about grandeur or promises. It's about presence, courage, and the choices we make for those we cherish. If this story touched your heart, like, comment, and share your favorite moment below. And don't forget to subscribe to Heartwoven Tales for more stories that stir the soul and keep you on the edge of your seat. Remember, love has many forms, but the strongest one always finds a way back. Until next time, stay captivated, stay inspired, and keep believing in the power of true love.